Good afternoon. My name is Margaret Rung, and I'm the director of the Center for New Deal Studies and an associate professor of history here at Roosevelt University. On behalf of the Center and the Office of the President at Roosevelt, I want to welcome you to the 21st Franklin and Eleanor Distinguished Lecture. Spearheaded by Anna Eleanor Roosevelt, longtime chair of the Center for New Deal Studies Advisory Board and a trustee of Roosevelt University, this annual program is designed to honor the legacy of her grandparents, Franklin and Eleanor. It is hard to envision a more fitting topic for this lecture than the reinvention of democracy. Indeed, the title of today's lecture echoes the experience of Americans in the 1930s when ordinary people, along with Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, reimagined, reinvented, and reinvigorated democracy during an era of extreme deprivation and wealth inequality. Like the Roosevelts, today's distinguished lecturer, President Fernando Henrique Cardoso, understands that democracy is a process. It requires constant vigilance and engagement by humane people who believe deeply in the principles of equality and justice. In fact, the founding of this university grew from a desire by a group of academics and students to reinvent, and for them that meant to democratize higher education. These courageous individuals who named the university in honor of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt built an institution based upon the ideals of social and economic justice, thus reflecting the power of democratic ideals when put into action. Before we begin the program, I would like to extend a warm welcome to our distinguished guests, in particular the Consular Corps in attendance. We are honored to have representatives from the consulates of Brazil in Chicago and Boston, Mexico, France, Nepal, Honduras, and the Taipei Economic and Cultural Office in Chicago. Roosevelt University also welcomes the Brazilian community of Chicago, including dignitaries from a number of Brazilian organizations, the president of McDonald's Latin America, along with activists, professionals, students, and others. Your large presence is a clear indication of the respect and admiration accorded President Cardoso, so thank you. Finally, I would like to thank a few people who have worked with me to organize this lecture: Lauren Chill, Tom Caro, Julie Rowan, Jennifer Taney, and the Roosevelt marketing team. As always, it's a pleasure to work with them. A special thanks to the graduate assistant for the Center for New Deal Studies, Sunny Santana, who worked with a lot of the logistics on this program. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge the Roosevelt alumni, staff, students, and my faculty colleagues who have, over the years, faithfully supported this wonderful event. I would now like to call the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, Bonnie Gunzenhauser, the Dean of the College of Performing Arts, Henry Fogel, and the President of Roosevelt University, Charles Middleton, to the podium for the conferring of the honorary degree upon President Cardoso. Thank you.
Colleagues, students, distinguished guests, welcome, and thank you for joining us today. It is a very great pleasure for me to introduce President Fernando Henrique Cardoso as a candidate for the degree of Doctor of Social Justice honoris causa. Dr. Cardoso served as President of Brazil from 1995 to 2003. Prior to holding political office, he built a career as an internationally renowned sociologist. During his post-presidential career, Cardoso has drawn on his academic and political expertise to serve as president of the Global Commission on Drug Policy and to found the Instituto Fernando Henrique Cardoso, which aims to produce and disseminate knowledge about the challenges of development and democracy, both in Brazil and in the larger world. In all of these distinguished endeavors, President Cardoso has embodied a truly Rooseveltian ideal. He has combined thought and action in the service of social justice. As a faculty member at the University of Sao Paulo, President Cardoso focused his early research on racial and social inequalities in Brazil, and then moved to focus on understanding and shaping the structures that could generate the means to change those inequalities. Despite being temporarily pushed out of Brazil by a repressive regime, President Cardoso maintained an active scholarly life, developing an international reputation as a scholar in areas today we would call globalization and democratization. He served as president of the International Sociological Association from 1982 to 1986. Even as he was building this academic profile, President Cardoso was also focusing on how to apply his knowledge to create positive change in his home country. After returning to Brazil, he campaigned and was elected to the federal Senate from the state of Sao Paulo in 1982. He served as senator for 9 years, then held positions as Minister of Foreign Affairs and Minister of Finance in the early 1990s, before being elected president and assuming office in 1995. President Cardoso won that election in a single round with 54% of the vote, nearly double that of his nearest opponent, and he won a second term nearly as easily 4 years later. To date, he is the only president to win office without a runoff election since the restoration of popular elections in Brazil in 1989. In his academic and political work, President Cardoso champions democracy not just as an abstract concept, but as a political practice. Grounded in a firm conviction that a democratic state should properly be understood as an arena of constructive struggle, Cardoso views broad and deep political participation as a primary indicator of a healthy democracy. As both intellectual and political practitioner, President Cardoso has sought, and I am quoting him here, not just to hold elections, but to transform Brazil's institutions into much stronger institutions, and simultaneously to open up the door to movements in order to create a state with ever greater potential for democracy and inclusion. As president, Cardoso built structures to enhance his country's capacity for democracy and inclusion. He was the first Brazilian president to start a program to address the structural inequality and enormous gap between the rich and the poor in that country, and he worked tirelessly to improve conditions for the most powerless groups in Brazilian society, registering a decline in child labor, a dramatic increase in primary education, and the resettlement of over 500,000 landless families during his presidency. President Cardoso has continued this work since stepping down from office, perhaps most notably through his membership in the Elders, a group of independent global leaders who work together to enhance peace and human rights around the globe. President Middleton, in recognition of these and many other outstanding achievements, it is my distinct honor to present Fernando Henrique Cardoso as a candidate to receive the degree of Doctor of Social Justice, honoris causa.
Go ahead, you can give him a round. Thank you, Dean Gunzenhauser. Fernando Henrique Cardoso, in recognition of your lifelong intellectual and activist work to bring about a better life for all people in your home country of Brazil, and with the authority vested in me by the Board of Trustees, it is a distinct honor to confer upon you the degree of Doctor of Social Justice, honoris causa. Congratulations. Very good. Excellent. Very good. That's the diploma.
Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I would like to thank Professor Bonnie Grudenhauser, who is the Dean of Arts and Science, who introduced my curriculum here and asked for me to be considered as a doctor. To the Professor Henry Fogel, Dean of Performing Arts, I would like to remind you that in another capacity, as chair of the São Paulo Orchestra Foundation, I received enormous support from Professor Fogel in a moment of transition in which it was extremely difficult for us to continue to keep the high quality of our orchestra. So thank you, Professor Fogel, again. And Professor and President Charles Middleton for the honorary degree that you confer upon me. I'm really very glad in receiving this doctorate here and to be with so many people in front of me, and specifically the ambassador of Brazil, Federico Araújo, and Paulo César de Carvalho, who are here. I'm very grateful to both of you and to all of you students, all ladies and gentlemen, professors. Well, I have to speak about the reinvention of democracy. I tried to make an analysis about how to reconcile demos, people, and republic, the institutions, res publica. It is a privilege for me to speak at the distinguished Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt lecture about challenges facing democracy in today's world. I'm very much aware that it is a great responsibility to speak about democracy here in the United States of America on this date of September 11th. Democracy, we know, is always a work in progress, an incomplete journey rooted in the history of each society. As the last 13 years have shown us again and again, democracy cannot be imposed from outside and is never achieved once and for all. It is never complete. In Latin America, democracy has been the great cause of my generation. From the 60s to the 80s, we had to fight long and hard to make the transition from dictatorship to democracy, as well as to establish separation and respect between executive, legislative, and judiciary powers. And yet today, in the region, it is more deeply rooted, in the region, where it is more deeply rooted, the Americas and Europe, representative democracy is in crisis. At the core of this crisis is the widening gap between people's aspirations and the capacity of political institutions to respond to the demands of society. It is one of the ironies of our age that this widespread deficit of trust in political institutions coexists with the rise of citizens capable of making the choice that shape their lives and influence the future of their societies. The proposition that I would like to submit to you today is that more than ever, freedom, this unquenchable human aspiration, is the driving force calling for a revitalization of politics and paving the way to the reinvention of democracy. I am very pleased with the opportunity to discuss these challenges in this particular forum dedicated to two of the greatest builders of contemporary democracy, Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. Roosevelt reinvented government at a time of profound national crisis. With his radiant energy and self-confidence, with no fear of the future, Roosevelt established a strong link between the individual and the nation. He proclaimed it as his goal, a better life for all Americans and a better American to live in. Thus, defining freedom and security, individual liberty and social justice as the touchstone of his message: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. As pointed out by Isaiah Berlin, the great majorities which he obtained in his favor presidential campaigns were ultimately due to an obscure feeling on the part of the majority of citizens of the United States that he was on their side, that he wished them all, and that he would do something for them. Franklin Roosevelt preserved and strengthened American democracy in a time of fear and disruption at home and abroad. Eleanor was the champion of downtrodden and played a prominent role in placing human rights at the center of the international agenda. The New Deal was an inspiration and point of reference to the social democratic experiment in post-war Western Europe. Learning the hard lessons that hatred and revenge do not lead to peace and reconciliation, the Marshall Plan was much more than a disaster plan relief. It enabled European economic recovery and helped a devastated continent to achieve economic stability and social security. The social democratic model enabled freedom to flourish alongside prosperity and social justice. And yet, the 50s in Europe and the United States were a time of social conformity. Material prosperity led to consumerism and fear associated with the Cold War to political conservatism. The apparent pause in the dynamics of change was shattered by the upheavals of the 60s. A new spirit of the time emerged, rebellious, defiant, and insolent. Social ferment challenged authority in all its forms, and profound cultural shifts were the hallmark of this extraordinary transitional decade. From the US to Europe and in Latin America, governments were contested by social and cultural movements. The civil rights movements challenged racial discrimination. The anti-war movement challenged United States foreign policy. Women and youth challenged ingrained structures of dominations and modes of behavior. In the open societies of the West, this was the moment in which the concept of political freedom began to extend to the realm of the personal and the intimate, the freedom to choose how to live one's life. Let me make a parenthesis. At that time, I was teaching at the University of Paris in Nanterre. And in my 68, I was a testimony of the enormous and profound movement that almost provoked a chaos in France, and in fact provoked a profound cultural transformation. And the movement exactly was the consequence of what I just referred to for you. The fact that each one would like to have a say in social life, and would prefer to be free from, even from structures, even from tradition. Of course, it was a momentum, but what a momentum. You could imagine how wonderful it was to live in Nanterre, in Paris, in May 68. Exactly how in the university in America, we had a similar movement toward another world, a world more plenty of liberty, in which each individual could participate in a direct way without being limited by superstructures. Well, this was the time when individuals started to decide by themselves how to deal with sexuality, marriage, reproduction, work, faith, duty, loyalty, health, and sickness, not as abstract problems, but as deeply moral choice involving consequences. The social and cultural ferment of this remarkable decade could not fail to influence the mindsets of the young men who launched the revolution in communication technologies that would ultimately lead to the globalized world we live in today. The development of personal communication tools, the emphasis on interactivity and networking were technological options that considerably strengthened the capacity of citizens to act and of society to transform themselves. My friend Manuel Castells, who is a Spanish sociologist, who also was young assistant professor at Nanterre and now is professor at the University of California, was one of the first to argue that by drastically shortening the dimensions of time and space, the new forms of instant electronic communication reshaped economy, society, and culture. Unlike previous technological breakthroughs, from the steam-powered engine to nuclear energy, the new information technologies affected not only production techniques and organizational structures, but also politics, values, and patterns of sociability. The dissemination of personal computers, the rise of the internet, and the World Wide Web, the interconnection of each with all, clearly facilitated the transition from a public sphere anchored in the traditional political institutions to a new public sphere structured around the communication system. The transformative impact of the new information technologies was sudden and devastating. Rigid, authoritarian, bureaucratic societies, incapable or unwilling to absorb these changes, were doomed to pay a heavy price. The Soviet Union imploded from within, mainly because of the new technologies. The integration of a global market operating on real time enabled market-based capitalism to encompass the whole world. Globalization extended the power of global companies vis-à-vis states, and even more fundamentally, created a financial global market largely unregulated, which would take us to the brink of a global disaster with the financial crisis of 2008. I mentioned in passing all these major changes to arrive at a crucial point. Globalization is at the root of the global crisis of political legitimacy, undermining the representative democracy for two very different, but in the end, convergent reasons. Understood not only as the free flow of economic and financial goods, but also as a free dissemination of information, ideas, and values, globalization drastically undercut the power of national states, while at the same time empowering the individual as a citizen. The emergence of a global economy operating on real time led to a profound crisis of the traditional institutions of national governance. Economics, trade, communication, culture became global, while representative democracy remained essentially national. Confronted with global trends and threats, the capacity of national states to provide safety was severely undercut. Surprisingly, it was the institutional setting of the United Nations that the emerging influence of citizens in their organizations first asserted itself as counterpoint to the power of national states. Despite the lofty opening words of its charter, the charter says, "We the peoples of the United Nations," the UN was unmistakably a member state organization, mainly concerned with avoiding another world war. Citizens had little to say on matters of peace and security. And yet, starting timidly in the 70s, the voices of citizens start to be heard across national frontiers. Human rights was the driving issue. Amnesty International invited ordinary people to write freedom letters to dictators, judges and jailers in support of political prisoners all over the world. The action was simple and effective. Anyone could do it anywhere. Perseverance was the key factor. Once adopted by a group of citizens, the prisoner was not forgotten. A very small gesture, tirelessly repeated, led to a great amount of pressure to put on bad guys throughout the world. Human rights became a public concern, and human rights organizations gained a voice in the UN formal deliberations on the issue. It was the beginning. The same happened with gender issues. In many countries, support from the UN provided the protection for women to challenge patriarchal structures. Then came the global theme par excellence, the environment. Scientists and green activists joined hands to force governments reluctantly to acknowledge that we all live in one planet with limited resources. Global health threats, especially HIV/AIDS, provide another strategic opportunity to citizen participation. In the case of HIV/AIDS, patients and doctors reframed the public perception of the problem, enabling care and solidarity to prevail over fear and rejection. NGOs and social movements brought to the table a commitment to a cause, reliable information, capacity to experiment, and financial resources. Different circumstances began to have their voice heard. Civil society, coalitions, free scientific community, women and faith-based groups, parliamentarians, and local authorities. This constructive engagement enabled a member state organization to evolve into a multi-thematic forum in which an emerging point of view of the humanity was articulated by non-state actors. As a consequence, many prominent issues of our time have been advanced by civil society and propelled by the power of public opinion. Now, new information and communication technologies added this potential. It has become almost easy for advocacy groups to be global as well as local. The failure of governments and national political system to respond to people's demands reached its apex with the global economic and financial crisis of 2008. Mesmerized by the idea that the markets are endowed with the power of self-regulation, governments failed to anticipate the global financial meltdown and were unable to protect their societies from its disastrous consequences. In the US, political gridlock, driven by blind partisan antagonism, suffocated the hopes for renewal generated by the election of President Obama. In Europe, the future of the European Union itself is at stake, giving it its incapacity to provide stability and security in a time of deep economic and social uncertainty. Where do we go from here? All opinion polls corroborate that the depth of trust and the sense of fatigue affecting political parties and parliaments, the backbone of representative democracy, is as widespread in Latin America as in Europe and in the United States. Last year, in Brazil, hundreds of thousands of protesters took the streets of cities big and small to vent their frustrations with government's incapacity to provide decent public services in the areas of education, health, and mobility. Brazilians want to live a life with dignity in a society that does not condone impunity and inequality vis-à-vis the law. The perception that politicians are insensitive to this demand explains the profound sense of disconnection between people's aspirations and political institutions. And yet, our societies have changed drastically, and for the better, over the last decades. NGOs and social movements were at the forefront of the struggle for democracy in Latin America. This organized dimension of civil society, however, today no longer accounts for the range and diversity of citizen action. Citizens today have multiple, overlapping identities and interests. Ethnic origin, age group, religious creed, sex orientation, consumption patterns, lifestyles may be a more powerful source of identity than social status. Individuals tend to be more intelligent, rebellious, and creative than in the past. They are called upon to make value judgments in life choice, where previously there was conformity to a pre-established destiny. Alert citizens no longer accept the role of passive audience. They don't want to be spectators, but actors. They want to speak and to be heard. They want the truth to be told to them in a straightforward way and want to be sure that their contribution will be taken into account. They have a communication power deriving from a conversation they engage with each other in the social network, which is personal and interactive. The dynamism of an open and connected society calls for more efficient and less arrogant actions by the state. In complex systems, order cannot be imposed from the top down by a center of command and control. There is no longer a grand narrative underpinning the actions of all actors. Change is a process that occurs simultaneously at multiple points. Pioneering actions, innovative experience, generate a critical mass of new ideas and messages that communicators amplify and retransmit throughout the system. To understand these profound changes in society and the rise of the new individual, more connected than organized, is the preeminent challenge for a democratic leader in today's world. Democracies have become a space for collective dialogue and deliberation, rather than simply an organized framework of institutions where generated will would emerge and be enforced. What we have now as the outcome of the democratic process are decisions or rules reflecting the give and take of conflicting interests and values. The more open and transparent the process, the more legitimate it is. What matters today is not a fluid will of all, but the participation of all concerned in the deliberation. This reality calls for a radically new style of political leadership. If I learned one lesson in my 8 years as president of Brazil, is that in today's world, political leadership is never gained once and for all. It must be constantly nurtured and renewed. It is no longer possible for the leader to impose without negotiating, to decide without listening, to govern without explaining and persuading. Votes in an election, even those of minutes of them, are not enough. The day after, one has to start almost for scratch. Either the leader inspires and mobilizes around a vision of the future, or the loss of power is inevitable. Democracy, for sure, implies the respect for basic political rights and civil liberties, such as multi-party political system, fair elections, freedom of expression, and respect of rules regardless the power of wealth. But democracy is more than the sum of its institutions and procedures. In a more substantive definition, democracy is embedded in society, nurtured and enhanced by citizens in a civic culture of participation, responsibility, and debate. Democracy is the capacity of ordinary people to shape their own lives and to influence the decisions that affect the future of their societies. How this process relates to representative democracy may be too soon to tell. My hope is that you have an influence, and in so doing, help to revitalize representative democracy and reinvent democracy itself. What is certain is that rethinking democracy has nothing to do with restriction of freedom and control of society. Our goal is not to undermine representative democracy, but to expand it, exploring new mechanisms through which it can communicate with other forms of manifestations of society. Actually, this is already happening. The movement for the full recognition of gay rights in the US is the latest example of how this interaction between pressure from society and institutional change can operate. The drive for the recognition of rights came from social mobilization, but it percolated through the political and the judicial system. Another example was the recent approval by the Brazilian Congress of a law banning candidates with criminal convictions from running to office. The initiative, which led to the called Clean State Bill, came from groups of citizens which built an alliance for change in the social media. When dealing with controversial biotech ethical issues, such as stem cell research or the right to die with dignity, Congress and courts are holding hearings in which the voice of different segments of public opinion and of the scientific community are heard. The decision remains in the hands of parliamentarians or judges, but the process of deliberation is much broader than in the past. It's time to conclude. We live today in an era of risk and uncertainty. Old certainties are indeed being put to the best, and all seems in a state of flux. put to the test, and all seems in a state of flux. As someone who has always been more concerned with seizing the unexpected rather than constants, we are living in a new world where power is more diffused, technological innovations drive social change, states are moved more vulnerable, and societies more resilient. It's time to move beyond the concept that only the state can build a nation. Citizen action and public opinion have transformative power, but institutions are necessary. There is no democracy without political parties. Structures provide the field of possibilities for human agency, but it's the will of individuals and segments of society, driven by values and interests, that creates the bridge for change. The future is not ours to see, but I would like to share with my friend Albert Hirschman an ingrained bias for hope. In my vision, politics is not the art of the possible. It is the art of making the necessary possible. That is to say, of extending the field of possibilities. The power of human agency, driven by reason and emotion, is what drives society forward. So I thank you very much for having the patience to hear me this afternoon. Thank you.